I'm Michelle Makori. This is Kitco News. Welcome back. We are back with Larry Lepard, managing partner and founder of Equity Management Associates, who maintains that Bitcoin is the most asymmetric investment opportunity in the world, especially as the US dollar is losing global might and facing devaluation and debasement. However, the anti-Bitcoin forces are intensifying their efforts, with Senator Elizabeth Warren building an anti-crypto army and Operation Chokepoint tightening its grip. That's the alleged US government program to choke the crypto sector off from access to financial services. And there's also a new bill in Congress which threatens to ban Bitcoin, the Restrict Act. All right, let us discuss all of this with Larry Lepard. Larry, we're talking about your macroeconomic scenarios in the first part of this interview, which I strongly suggest people watch ahead of this. And because Bitcoin is seen as an alternative to traditional finance, and as we're seeing the cracks in the financial system grow and intensifying, it seems like we're seeing more regulation in the US and around the world against Bitcoin. Now, we have the obvious attacks. So let's start off with the more obvious ones, like from Senator Elizabeth Warren. She's unveiled her Senate re-election campaign, and she's running on an explicitly anti-crypto platform. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I don't know where to start there. I don't have a lot of love for Liz. Well, she must be thinking, it must poll well. She must be thinking that her voters will like it. Look, some of the anger against crypto, and let me start off and make a very important distinction, okay? In my opinion, Bitcoin is the only cryptocurrency with any value, full stop. I don't even believe in Ethereum. And I'll explain that very quickly why. It's because Bitcoin has a decentralized management structure, decentralized organization structure, and it's because Bitcoin has a known monetary policy where there'll only be 21 million of them. Every other cryptocurrency, in my opinion, is an unregulated security. It has a CEO, and they have a policy of issuing some number of tokens based upon what the CEO or others say. And as long as that's the case, it's really just like the government. They can dilute their crypto. And so all crypto, in my opinion, is a fraud. Bitcoin is actually an important technological innovation, which is immutable digital scarcity, full stop. So let me say that. A lot of people are mad at crypto, and they should be. And where Warren is coming from and where this choke point thing is coming from is partly out of embarrassment. I mean, Sam Bankman-Fried, basically rug pulled, billions, literally billions of dollars, bigger than Bernie Madoff, right? Billions of dollars of capital from unsuspecting investors who had money in his FTX organization. And where was the SEC when this was going down? I mean, those of us in the crypto industry or in the investment industry focused on Bitcoin, we knew Bankman-Fried was a fraud. We were like that guy who was calling out Madoff, Markopoulos. I mean, we basically knew Bankman-Fried was a fraud. It was so obvious. And yet, Gary Gensler was sitting on his thumbs. And there's some who've even said, as you pointed out pre-show, that maybe it was intentional. They wanted to blow up crypto. But the point is, the horse escaped. And now Washington is embarrassed and they're trying to close the barn door. And that's just wrong. They're not making a distinction between crypto and Bitcoin. And more importantly, the horse has already escaped. So I'm not quite sure where she's coming from. I think she probably pulled it and it'll get her votes. She's a corrupt politician. She's never had a salary of over $250,000 a year, and she has a $60 million net worth. How does that happen? And it's shocking.
Yeah. A lot of that happening in Congress. Nancy Pelosi, one of the greatest traders of all time.
Exactly.
Arguably.
I mean, it's horrible. So, but having said that, I think it goes beyond that because we can move into choke point and the restrict.
Yeah, let's talk about that because we've got Senator Warren, and as you've said, the FTX collapse really laid the groundwork for regulators to march in with ferocity and indignation, and there is speculation. Purely speculation that perhaps the FTX collapse was engineered intentionally in order to lay down the groundwork for a potential Bitcoin ban or cryptocurrency attack because it is such a threat to traditional finance. So we have the obvious attempts, like Senator Warren, coming out there guns blazing, saying big anti-crypto army ahead. But then there are the less obvious attempts, the more subtle ones, which perhaps are the more dangerous ones, like Operation Chokepoint 2.0, And that is the alleged government program to choke crypto from its sources of financing in the traditional banking sector, cut off the on-ramps and the off-ramps, if you will. So for our viewers who may not be aware, break down what Operation Chokepoint 2.0 is.
Sure, I would go even further than saying it's alleged. I mean, I think it's because those of us who are in the industry and who've talked to a lot of the people in DC know the government has made a very concerted effort to try and shut down banks that are helping the crypto industry. In fact, Barney Frank, who was the author of, Dodd-Frank, was on the board of Signature Bank, and Signature Bank was shut down by the government, and it was not in trouble. And the reason they shut it down is because it was doing a lot of business with these crypto companies, and they didn't like that. We've also seen a company called Custodia, run by a woman named Caitlin Long, who's very active on Twitter. It's a company I've invested in, full disclosure, so I believe in her thesis, who is trying to establish a fully reserved bank that does business and would have a stable coin that would work with Bitcoin. And the Federal Reserve has shut her down. And she has basically found out through back channels that has occurred because the major banks in New York, I'm looking at Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan, but I think there are others involved, have gone to Jerome Powell and said, this would not be good for our business. We do not want banks that are focused on Bitcoin in this manner. And so, the Federal Reserve has not granted her the license to build a crypto bank that by law she ought to be entitled to. So, you're seeing the banking lobby and the traditional finance lobby laying the pressure on people in DC to speak out. And there are other representatives and folks in Congress who occasionally came up. I can't remember the name of the congressman, but one of the congressmen actually got up on the floor and named Custodia Bank as being a rogue bank, which, first of all, it doesn't even exist yet. It's just an idea. And he spoke out about it, which tells you how threatened they are by it. And so yes, the vested interests in the banking world do not want to see crypto survive. I mean, and let me just give you another example. This is really, we touched on this earlier when you and I talking. So crypto, Bitcoin is Bitcoin, and it's a store of value and so on and so forth. One of the things that's happened in Bitcoin that some people are aware of and others aren't, but I would encourage people to get involved in it and know about it, is something called the Lightning Network. The Lightning Network allows people to move currency, money, between themselves for less than a penny per transaction. And, right now, MasterCard and Visa are charging, 3% or 300 basis points on every single transaction you make using their cards. This would effectively destroy their businesses. And so you can see that there are very big vested interests that do not want to let cryptocurrency disrupt the existing financial, system.
I mean, it's cryptocurrency, it's decentralized finance, which is a huge threat to the traditional financial system. But then, of course, there's also the idea of Bitcoin, which could be a big threat to fiat currency, the US dollar, and a potential central bank digital currency, a digital form of fiat. But before we get into that relationship, and we discussed in part one of this interview why the US dollar is looking decidedly on shakier and shakier ground, one of the other attempts potentially to rein this whole situation in, because it's such a threat, is the Restrict Act, which is currently being looked at by Congress. Now, that's intended to ban the app TikTok, which many claim is a tool of Chinese Communist Party intelligence. The dangers there have been sort of pretty widely accepted, that TikTok poses a problem from a national security point of view in many ways. But this particular Restrict Act ban, for example, could be used to ban Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, because the language in the bill is very vague. For example, the act would empower the Secretary of Commerce to ban transactions in which a foreign adversary has an interest. And that's very problematic, because a foreign adversary can be defined vaguely. The ban on transactions can extend to any cryptocurrency. So how much of a concern do you think this Restrict Act is, should it actually pass?
If it passed, it's a huge concern. I mean, as I recall, the version I read, they were talking about 10 plus years in prison and $1 million fines. I mean, this was terribly scary. And I pray, and I don't believe it'll pass, and I pray it doesn't pass. But this is not surprising to me. I mean, and this goes back to our first part of the conversation where, look, the people who run the system, they're very, very rich, and they're very, very powerful, and they want to defend the system. And so they are going to use every tool they think they can get away with to try to force all of us to comply. I mean, the CBDC that you alluded to is another, that's a central bank digital currency and we know the Fed has one, and we know they beta tested it. And, and to a degree, they probably, I mean, in a sense, the scandemic was probably a trial run of some other control mechanisms that they want to use on us in the future. So I don't put anything past these people in power, but I actually am rather optimistic that, Americans, most Americans aren't going to fall for this shit. I mean, they're going to tell me to use a CBDC, and I'm going to give them the finger. I mean, the only ones who are going to accept a CBDC are the people who are desperate for cash. And of course, they'll take that because they literally need it to live. But, these kinds of acts and things are blatantly un-American, unconstitutional, and not not based on the principles that this country was founded on. But what would you expect from a very, very corrupt, very, very powerful set of rulers and governors who, think that they can get away with this stuff? And so my view is, as you and I were speaking about offline, our job, you're doing a great job of it through your show. I do it on Twitter and other places. Our job is to try and educate as many of our fellow citizens that, hey, this stuff is bullshit. And these people are lying, and they're corrupt, and they say the black letter law is this, and then they violate the laws. I mean, Janet Yellen tells us, she flip-flopped 5 times on whether they were going to back all the banks. I mean, this is a woman who got paid $7 million for giving speeches to the banks. I mean, what could she possibly say that's worth $7 million? Nothing. They gave her $7 million as a bribe so that she would go easy on the regulation of the banks. And that's just the way the system works. As George Carlin said, it's a big club and we ain't in it.
Right. Well, Larry, because it's a big club that is quite desperate to maintain its exclusive membership,
Right.
Again, this brings me to the biggest existential risk to Bitcoin. You touched on CBDCs, central bank digital currency. So just to clarify again for our viewers, as this notion is still gaining traction, It is a form of fiat issued by a central bank, which is on a blockchain or open ledger type of platform, not necessarily blockchain, but something similar, which would allow the government to monitor every single transaction made. So zero privacy, zero anonymity, and also it is programmable. So the government would, in theory, be able to program the currency to work or not work, depending on the transaction. And as a recap for our viewers that are still catching on to the concept of a CBDC, my concern, or the concern of many others, is that it would be very easy to combine the notion of ESG and climate change with the idea of a CBDC and saying, well, your currency is restricted against making certain purchases that impact carbon offsets, for example. So you're banned from flying more than 10 times a month. Michelle, you've exceeded your carbon footprint allowance. Your money doesn't work to buy another ticket, or it does, but with a premium, for example.
Well, let me just extract even further. I mean, how far are we away from then? You have a social credit score, right? The way the Chinese do, and so. Yeah. Hey, Michelle, I saw your podcast yesterday, and you said something negative about the government. Well, guess what?
I'm on the list, Larry. If this thing happens, I'm in trouble.
We know that. We both are. But the point is that yes. I mean, what becomes acceptable behavior? Because they can go in and grab the money out of your CBDC. I mean, look, we saw them do that with the Russians. They said, well, you can't invade Ukraine. We're going to take your $600 billion. Now, debatable whether, well, it's just, yes. I mean, it's all a mechanism for control. I mean, just as, telling us we had to take these vaccines was a mechanism of social control. And, it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible.
So, Larry, because Bitcoin is seen by many as the alternative to this mechanism of control, why would you be so convinced that every single action possible would not be taken to wipe out Bitcoin? Because it's the antidote to this control.
Yeah. So, well, no, I believe they may take a lot of bad actions. And I think we talked offline about this. I mean, it's possible they're going to tax Bitcoin heavily. It's possible they could outlaw. It's possible they say you're going to deal with Bitcoin, you're going to go to jail for 10 years. I mean, I think at some point as the currency starts to collapse, I could very easily see, and I saw a little bit of it the last time around, I could very easily see people in positions of power saying, these gold and Bitcoin people, they're really kind of ruining our monetary system. And that what they're doing is un-American. I mean, and just as they told us we had to buy, government bonds to support World War II, they're going to say these, gold and Bitcoin people are bad people, and we need to tax that shit like 90%. I mean, that's entirely possible. I don't, write that off. The thing though, that here's where I think we ultimately win. America's not the only country in the world. There are, 300 million of us or something. There are billions of people in the world. Okay. And Bitcoin's not really seizable. If you've got it on cold storage, you've got your 12 seed words, they can't take it away from you. They might know you have it because they can follow it. Unless you've cleaned your coins, they can follow where you got it from. They can't really take it away from you. I mean, you're as strong as an army in terms of defending your wealth. I mean, every other time in history up until this point in time, if you had money and you didn't have the guns in the army to defend your money, they could take it from you. It was either in a bank, in which case they could see the records of the bank and take it, or it was gold, or it was something that you would store. And guess what? If enough people show up with guns, they can threaten to take your gold. Well, if you could have $1 billion worth of Bitcoin and 12 words would secure it, now they could threaten to kill you and say, if you don't give us the 12 words, we're going to kill you.
There is that.
Yeah, and they might. But if you had the 12 words, and you'd given them to other relatives and they didn't know who, I mean, the point is they can't get the wealth. They just can't, short of killing you. And even if they kill you, they're not necessarily able to get the wealth. That equation is a very important equation. This guy on Twitter named Jason Lowry, who talks about this a lot, he does a great job of it. And so it's going to change. It literally changes the balance of power between individuals and governments. And I think we're going to a much more decentralized world in the future. And I think big governments peaked in World War II. They managed to figure out how to slaughter 50 million people. And ever since then, we've been going towards a decentralized world. And the microchip started it, the internet spread it, and Bitcoin is going to help to perfect it. And I think, 50 or 100 years from now, we won't have enormous nation states. We'll have smaller nation states and, smaller groups of people who decide to live together and, more of a kind of a Swiss version of democracy rather than these big nations that are clashing with one another. So that's just my hope and my dream.
Okay. That's very big picture. But let me bring it a little bit more into the near term, because one could argue that maybe it'll be too problematic to outright sort of ban Bitcoin at this point. But you could say that if you wanted to manipulate the Bitcoin market, and if you wanted to control it, and if you wanted to damage it, then you could do that through a derivative, through a Bitcoin ETF. Yep. Because many of the gold investors know that there is tremendous speculation that the gold market is manipulated through derivatives, saying that there's more paper gold than there is real gold. And if you wanted to influence the price of Bitcoin dramatically, manipulate it, control it, you could do that through an ETF, through derivatives. Warren Buffett, who obviously doesn't like Bitcoin, but Warren Buffett does call derivatives financial weapons of mass destruction. So keeping that in mind, should Bitcoin spot ETF be launched, several of them, and we bring in the whole derivative equation, could that be a sort of insider way to then bring Bitcoin down? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a really smart question. Let's skip the ETF for a minute and just talk about Bitcoin derivatives. So there already are Bitcoin derivatives. They're futures and options, and then they're over the counter. And a site on the web called Glassnode keeps track of them. And fortunately, the amount of Bitcoin derivatives is very small compared to the Bitcoin outstanding and compared to the gold market. They've had 50 plus years to build the paper gold market. And it's not even up for debate anymore. The gold price is massively manipulated as a result of the paper. They could try and do the same thing with Bitcoin, and I think there's a possibility that they will. It's going to be harder because it's more volatile. I mean, Bitcoin has gone up 5x in less than a year and a half. Gold's never done that. But they have a printing press, and if you have a printing press and you take big losses and you can just print the whole, it doesn't really matter. And that's, of course, what they've done when they've had to in the gold market. So My strong belief is that when Bitcoiners win and Bitcoiners and gold people win and sound money advocates have control of the government, because we've got all the marbles, which is how I see the future going, that one of the first things they're going to do is they're going to outlaw financial derivatives, because Buffett's right. They are weapons of mass destruction. They're also weapons of control. Basically, financial derivatives say that whoever is the final backstop or whoever has control of the printing press wins by definition, because they can just print more money. I mean, you can always increase the size of the bet, and they have no constraint on their resources as a result of the fact that they've got a printing press. So financial derivatives need to be banned, and the threat of derivatives to Bitcoin is real, but it's not large yet. I say yet because as things go down the road, it could become more real, but it's something we can watch because we can see a lot of the transactions, and okay. I think we'll have a sense if and when it's becoming an issue.
So what do you think then is the biggest existential threat to Bitcoin?
Honestly, I don't. I've said before, the technology could fail. I'm convinced that's not likely to happen. People could stop adopting it and using it. I don't see any evidence that that's happening. I see all kinds of use cases and growth all around the world. So I don't think that's going to happen. I think the government could slow it down in the kind of things we're talking about. I mean, I think if they decided to make it a crime for using Bitcoin, they decided to tax it at 90%. If all of the governments of the world in a coordinated fashion decided they really wanted to try and kill this, I don't think they'd kill it, but I think they would severely slow it down. Having said that, I think the war would become much more aggressive, because, it would be a signal to people that, well, why are governments doing this? What is it? Why are they so threatened by this thing? If it's not anything that's good, why does it threaten them? And so I can't really foresee a case where Bitcoin doesn't win in the longer run, but I do foresee cases where there are severe bumps as a result of actions that governments can take. Okay. And as we've talked about, they will defend themselves. We know that. And they'll cheat. We know that too.
Well, we talked about governments defending themselves and bolstering their own positioning by secretly buying gold. This is not necessarily the US government, but we spoke about the de-dollarization trend in part one of this interview, and how central banks around the world have been making record gold purchases, but not being that upfront about it. Some of them even perhaps not even declaring the amount of gold that they truly have. What do you think is happening with regards to central banks and Bitcoin mining or Bitcoin purchasing?
Fascinating question. I don't think the Chinese like it at all. I don't think they're doing anything with it. I've heard a lot of stories that would suggest that the Russians kind of get it, and that there are Russian utility companies and perhaps even the Russian government mining Bitcoin, which I find fascinating.
You think the Russian government is mining Bitcoin?
Well, I've heard rumors of that I think they actually get it. They understand it. And
couldn't you see that by the hash rate of activity coming from Russia?
We do know, yes, we've seen we know there is hash coming from Russia. Okay, what we don't know is if the government's involved.
Okay.
We do know that Russian utilities who have excess cheap power are using it to mine Bitcoin. We know that for a fact. Do those utilities have the blessing of the government? And does the government believe in it? We don't know. Mm-hmm. But they are, I do believe, both Russia and China, from reading their internal papers and hearing their speeches, they are both very much aware of the fiat scam. They really are. They've as much as said it. They both know that the U.S. has used fiat dollars to colonize and take advantage of the world. That part of the U.S.'s global power is their ability to print money to buy resources and to control the dollar and to use the dollar as a weapon. They both know that, and they've said it. So with that as a backdrop, they both trended towards gold. China has hated on Bitcoin, and so I don't think they're smart enough to be doing it internally. But Russia, they might actually be doing it. I just don't know.
Okay. Look, to be fair, there has been excessive weaponization of the dollar, but I do think it's important to point out that the dollar has also been used in a way to prevent kinetic war, to prevent military conflict, and to rein in bad actors. I mean, granted, there has been potential abuse of this global reserve currency privilege, but essentially one could say that, the US has taken on, for better or worse in many regards, the role of the international sort of police, and that there have been bad actors that did require reining in, and rather than military conflict, sort of sanctions have come through.
I mean, some of that. I mean, I don't want to hate on my country because we've done some good things, but we've also done a lot of bad things too, and so it's they're two sides of the same coin, right? I mean, yes, you're right. I mean, look, we keep the sea lanes open, we prevent piracy. There are a lot of things that this country was built on that we still stand for that are very admirable, but there are also things that we've done that are less than admirable in my view.
All right, but let's bring it back to Bitcoin, because as we discussed in part one of this interview, there are a number of factors that indicate that the dollar could be nearing its demise. You've said in part one of this interview that you think it could happen as soon as in 10 years' time, and that you do see a reset. If that reset does involve a central bank digital currency, an idea that is gaining traction, how do you see Bitcoin fitting in a CBDC world? Can they coexist?
Oh, I think they can definitely coexist. It'll just be a parallel thing. I mean, I think, look, money is a lot of things, right? I mean, it's something you use to buy coffee with, but it's also, let's break it into two big buckets. There's the exchange bucket, and then there's the kind of savings and asset bucket. Okay, we all need money for exchange. You need to pay for your gas, pay for your food, pay for your coffee, whatever. You got to pay your bills. That's the exchange function of money, and you earn money and you turn around and you spend money, and so. If its value fluctuates a little bit in that time frame, big deal. It doesn't really matter. But then ultimately you've got your savings and your assets, and so you got to decide where are you going to put those. And so, I mean, if the government, if they say you got to pay your taxes in CBDCs, well, then I'm going to have to briefly own some CBDC to pay my taxes. Okay, fair enough. But I'm not going to save in CBDCs because it's something they can print. They can print to excess. And so, the point I guess I'm trying to make is, I think the intelligent people in the world, and ultimately most people get the joke and realize that, that fiat currency is losing value consistently. And as that trend grows, people will go to Bitcoin. They'll go to Bitcoin, they'll go to gold, they'll go to property. Nobody's going to be stupid enough to buy bonds from a set of governments that have proven that they can't manage the currency correctly. So I think CBDCs could very easily be a parallel system to gold and Bitcoin as savings technology in a way.
So gold and Bitcoin would be saving technology in a CBDC world?
I would think so. Yeah. I mean, in other words, let's say you were paid in CBDCs, you would immediately, if I were paid in CBDCs, if they forced the whole world into CBDCs, I would immediately exchange. There'd be a CBDC gold exchange rate or a CBDC Bitcoin exchange rate. I'd immediately change it and I'd save in the hard currency. That's just Gresham's law. And I think, again, unless they outlaw or massively tax the alternatives, the system they've got, and this is why they're trying to block the exits. This is why they don't want, the choke point came around as a result of the fact that they don't want people exiting their system, right? They don't want you to go to the safe haven of Bitcoin. They don't want you to go to the safe haven of gold. They shit on them every chance they get. And yet, we all know that we can't trust their currency to hold value because of the way they behave. And we know that for a fact, and that's only going to get worse. And really the only thing, Michelle, that standing between us and hyperinflation is everybody coming to the conclusion that I've come to, which is that these currencies are doomed. And so as a result of that, do I hold dollars? Of course I hold dollars. I need to pay my bills.
Right.
But, every asset, I get paid a certain amount of money. I pay my bills. I have something left over. The leftover goes into gold or Bitcoin. Right.
Well, one would hope that despite all attempts, that doesn't become a situation where all the on-ramps and off-ramps of converting CBDCs, if it does in fact go there, to gold and Bitcoin are shut. But again, these are sort of the worst case scenarios that I am predicting here or discussing here.
Well,
predicting.
Look, it's always worth thinking about. You've got to think outside of the box. I'm sure you and maybe some of your listeners have read a book called The Mandibles, which is really a very interesting story of a family that lived through the currency collapse, a futuristic family lived through a currency collapse in the United States. It's an eye opener. I mean,
Right.
have you read it? Are you familiar with it? Have you read it?
That is going to have to be on my to-read list.
You
I've
got to
not
get it
read
on
the
your list.
manuals. Yeah.
If you want to see the worst case and you want to understand the implications, I mean, it was a real eye opener for me. It's a novel, but the woman who wrote it is very intelligent, and it, as each step unfolded, I thought to myself, well, that makes sense. That could happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, to me, for sound money people, the mandibles is kind of is a horror story of how this might unfold. Hopefully it doesn't look like that.
All right, I'll add it to my list. I'm still having nightmares from Aldous Huxley and George Orwell. There
you go. It's right in there with those guys.
As those novels. But let's focus a little bit on the positive side. Bitcoin, one of the top performing assets year to date. What do you see in terms of adoption? We've discussed the adoption curve of new technologies and how after a certain tipping point, the mass adoption sort of catches on. Explain that adoption chart for us as it applies to new technologies and where Bitcoin is on that adoption curve.
Yeah, sure. So Malcolm Gladwell had a theory that said that, and he looked at a lot of developments, historical developments of technologies, autos, washing machines, cell phones, computers. And what it says is the amount of time it takes from 0% penetration to 10% penetration of the population, the number of years that takes, then in turn, the next set of that number of years gets you from 10% to 90%. So, in this case, in the Bitcoin case, it was, 14 years old. And I think we estimate that about 10% of the world, or 10% of the first world, owns Bitcoin or is involved in Bitcoin in some form. And so, and certainly more than that are aware of it, but I'm talking about people who've actually bought some. And so if it took 14 years to get to 10%, the theory is it would take another 14 years and 90% of the world would own some Bitcoin. If it really is the technological innovation that I believe it is. And so, that would imply that we're going to go through a very big growth curve here. And, you've got this is, as a commodity, Bitcoin is, there's a fixed supply. There are only 21 million of them. It's the only, this is very interesting. It's the only commodity in the world where supply does not go up as a result of higher prices. Think about it. If gold goes to $10,000 tomorrow, we're going to mine more gold. There's just no doubt, right? Because we know where it is. It's just not economic to get it out of the ground. Whereas if Bitcoin goes to $100,000, tomorrow, there's not going to be any more Bitcoin created. So that's a very powerful thing. And so, there's 7+ billion people on the planet. There are 21 million of these coins. It's a very sound form of money. As more and more people come to see, I should save in this money, the price is going to go, in my opinion, much higher. I mean, I think we'll hit 100,000, then I think we'll hit 1 million, then I think we'll ultimately hit $10 million a coin. I mean, I'm sure my grandkids will be shocked at people who own one whole coin. I mean, being a whole coiner will be a big deal. I mean,
let's break that down a little bit.
Right?
I mean, look, so when we see the price of Bitcoin rise, we do see mining activity accelerate, which does create more supply, but ultimately capped at 21 million, as you're saying there. So what you mentioned a couple of Bitcoin price points along the way there. Where
I think 100,000 within 2 years, maybe 150.
But we've said this before, Larry. Yeah. I can just tell the comments from the gold investors. Oh, they said 100,000 Bitcoin 2 years ago. We've already made these projections. So
look, it's extremely volatile, and it's impossible to know exactly where it's going to go. I mean, we hit 67 in the last peak, 67, 68. So we didn't make it to 100. And we hit 16 on this bottom. But if you kind of look at the pattern, you look at how far it tends to go off the bottom of the pattern, it would strike me that the next run ought to take us to about 100. And that would probably be sometime within the next 2 years. And then that 100 would probably correct down to 40, we're higher than it is today. And then the 40, wave up from there might take us to, 200, 250, something like that. I mean, it's, it tends to go in waves. I mean, we've seen these cycles since it was formed. I mean, these were at much smaller degrees, but I mean, it went to 1,000, then it went back down to 200 or 300. I mean, I bought it at 17,000 in Thanksgiving of 2017 and went down to 10, then it went down to 3,500, and I bought more, but so it's quite volatile, as we've seen, but that you've got two things going on here that support it. One, you've got an adoption curve. I mean, I was involved in investing in the internet. Reminds me a lot of the internet. More and more people are becoming aware of it. More and more people are using it. The second thing you've got going on is you've got this underlying thing that's driving gold as well, which is the monetary debasement. So you kind of got two trends that push it. One, just more and more people use it, and you really need to read a little bit about that. I highly recommend a book by Alex Gladstein called "Check Your Financial Privilege," which tells you the story of how people are using it around the world, how the unbanked are using it. All you need is a smartphone, and you can make lightning transactions. And there are poor women in Afghanistan doing technology work that couldn't figure out how to get paid. They're getting paid Bitcoin on their smartphone through the Lightning Network. And there are thousands of stories like that. Domestics working overseas, sending their money back in the form of Bitcoin so they don't have to pay the usurious fees to Western Union. So, these kinds of applications, or we call them use cases, are going to spread the development of this thing as time goes by. And the fixed supply and the fact that, savings in this asset have tended to grow over time. If you take a 5-year perspective, there's never been a 5-year period where even if you bought at the peak, you weren't ahead. In fact, something on the web recently I saw that was very interesting. If you started buying Bitcoin at the peak at $68,000 a year and change ago, and you bought an equal amount between then and today, okay, every week, you just turned positive on your investments because it was 68, it went down to 16, and it's called dollar cost averaging.
Dollar cost averaging, yeah.
Right, and now it's at 30, and you're positive. You're net ahead, even though you started buying at 68. So and that's how I recommend people to do it. Actually, is to dollar cost average into it because it is volatile. There's no doubt.
All right, Larry, we're running out of time here. I do have a lot more questions for you. We'll have to come back with a part 3, but give me a near-term price prediction.
Well, near-term price prediction, I think within, so is it 2023? I think by the end of 2024, we'll definitely be at 100,000. I'll write that in stone, probably higher. I think by the way, at the end of 2024, I think gold will be well over 3,000, maybe 3,500. Or higher. And
do you have an end of 2023 Bitcoin price
end of 2023
prediction?
for Bitcoin? What's it, 30 now? I guess at the end of the year, we'd be bumping up against the old high. We'd be kind of right at it, 67-ish, 68, something like that.
But you're not putting that in stone for me. You're putting 2024, 100,000 in stone?
Yeah, 2024, 100,000. I'll put that in stone. I think there's a high probability we're at 60 by the end of the year in Bitcoin. We're at 30 now. That's not that far out there. And I think there's a high probability we're at 3,000 in gold by the end of the year. And the reason I say this is I see the cracks in the financial system. I mean, I think if anything, both of those projections are probably too low. I mean, in other words, it's probably going to be higher than that. But I don't want to say a higher number and then I come up a little short and you say, oh, you missed it.
You're being very bold, putting a number and a timeline, and I always respect and appreciate the guests that do that.
It's what I do. I mean, I tell you what, I think gold stocks will probably be 100% higher by the end of the year. I think the GDX and the GDXJ will be 100% by the end of this calendar year. I mean, I can't believe how deeply undervalued gold stocks are. And just, if you allow me to shill my fund for a moment, I hope you don't mind. I run a gold stock fund that is deeply undervalued. So any qualified investor can have a look at it. We're also putting together a Bitcoin fund that does Bitcoin and Bitcoin private companies that I think is going to take advantage of this trend. Same thing, qualified investors. Anyone who's interested, reach out to me at my website or the other thing to follow, excuse me, my thinking. I'm kind of a chatterbox or loudmouth on Twitter. So follow me on Twitter. And, you'll see daily kind of what I'm thinking. That's all sound money related stuff. So.
All right. Well, Larry, thank you for chatting with us. I really appreciate your time. We'll have you back soon because there are some other bigger Bitcoin issues we need to get through. But it's a wrap for now. Thank you, as always. Really appreciate you sharing your insight. And again,
it's a lot of fun, Michelle. I'm happy to come back. Just tell me when and we'll set something up. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Larry Lepard. And thank you for watching. I'm Michelle Makori. If you are watching this on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you soon.